All right, last little lecture for this week is sort of the last bit of what's, I think, interesting about skepticism. This is called the problem of induction. Basically, it's a skeptical problem about the process of induction by which we know pretty much all of science. And this problem was raised by this famous philosopher, David Hume. So David Hume, he was a brilliant Scotsman. It's actually kind of funny in the history of philosophy. Some people took issue with him, as particularly Englishmen, because he was a Scotsman, which is absurd. He was sort of an atheist. He was like kind of early for being a real atheist, but he kind of kept that a secret, I think, when he was younger. He sort of started psychology. I mean, he wasn't the actual person that was the first person to think about the mind, but he did kind of first imagine studying the mind as like a real scientific thing to study, which is really interesting. So he's kind of famous for that, for partly being an early proponent of the philosophy of mind. And he was an empiricist. That is, he believed that all of our, or pretty much most of our knowledge comes by way of, our senses, our knowledge of the external world. He had a big problem with metaphysics. Metaphysics, remember, is like makes claims about the nature of reality. And he had a problem with metaphysics because he thought that metaphysical claims just couldn't really be verified or proven. They were just outlandish claims that were sort of out there, and you couldn't really know them. So let's talk about it. Here's a famous thing that Hume is famous for is this dilemma. Basically, Hume divided all of reasoning into two kinds, and we'll see if you believe that this is plausible. So he thought that, okay, there's two kinds of reasoning. There's reasoning regarding the relations between ideas and reasoning regarding facts out in the world, right? Reasoning regarding relations of ideas are things like math, right? Things like analytic concepts. When you know that a bachelor is an unmarried male, you know that all and only unmarried males are bachelors, right? You know the relationships between other kinds of ideas, right? So like the relationship between being a cat and being a mammal. That's a concept. Those are two concepts, the cat concept and the mammal concept. And you know that if something is a cat, then it's a mammal. And that's a necessary truth, right? It's always got to be true. And the idea here is just, well, okay, what is that kind of reasoning? When you're thinking like, okay, well, if a thing is water, then it's made of H2O. Well, that's basically reasoning in such a way that you are reasoning between the relations of ideas. You've got an idea of a cat and an idea of what it is to be a mammal, and that relationship between those two concepts holds. The other kind of reasoning is reasoning regarding facts in the world, right? So observable events, things that you see out in the world, objects, properties that objects have, things that you are immediately in contact with, things that leave impressions in your mind. Those are things that you can know. Now, according to Hume, nothing else makes sense to reason about. That is, like, you can't, if something isn't, when you're reasoning, having to do with the relations between ideas, then it can't really be something that you can reason about unless it's a fact out in the world. So either it's something that you can sort of see out in the world, there's those kinds of facts, or you reason in such a way that you're reasoning between your concepts, right? Well, problem. Here's a metaphysical claim. The future-like past principle. The future-like past principle says that the future will be just like the past. Question, is this principle a relation of ideas or a matter of fact? Turns out that it looks like it's neither. And if it's neither, then according to Hume, he says that it must be committed to the flames. That is, he thinks any kind of reasoning that isn't, is metaphysical and isn't about relations between ideas or matters of fact ought to be tossed. Now, why is this an issue? Look, you believe in induction. You believe that things that you observe now are going to be similar when you observe them again in the future. When you see something happen now, you take that to heart and you think, oh, okay, well, then it's probably going to happen similarly again in the future. That's how you get good at stuff, right? I mean, like, you probably all hopefully are able to drive. A lot of you, I'm sure, have your driver's license. How do you get good at driving? Well, by driving a lot, like by seeing, by experiencing it once, and then you learn, and then you come to know what to expect, and then you have beliefs about how things are going to go on the road. And so you get good at driving. I mean, that's how you get good at almost anything, by believing, by experiencing it, by practicing, and then getting better as time goes on. There are much more basic things, though, that you believe on the basis of induction, right? That, like, the sun is going to rise tomorrow, right? You believe that the sun will rise tomorrow. Do you know that the sun is going to rise tomorrow? Well, it seems like you probably do. That tomorrow gravity is still going to work, that gravity is going to keep working in the exact same way that it's working now from moment to moment. Or that when you open your eyes tomorrow after sleeping, things are going to look pretty much as they did before. But what reason do you really have for thinking each of these things? What reason do you think do you have for thinking that tomorrow stuff's going to be sort of similar to the way that it was today? Well, the reason, and the reason that basically Hume is taking issue with, is this principle. You are relying implicitly, if not explicitly, that is, like, sort of in the background of your reasoning, on a principle that says the future is going to be like it was in the past. Things in the future are going to be similar to how things are now and how things were in the past. This principle undergirds all of inductive reasoning. That is, all reasoning from, limited cases. If you have, if I've seen 100 white swans, it seems like I can, on the basis of inductive reasoning, infer that all swans are white. And if I come across a black swan, then it turns out that my inductive reasoning was incorrect. But that's just how that works, right? It seems like, for the most part, we are actually good at this, right? So the sun has risen every single day of my life up till now. And so I think I have good reason for believing that the sun is going to rise tomorrow. How? Well, because I think that just like how it was in the past, things will continue on into the future. The future will be like the past. But what reason do we actually have for thinking that the future is going to be like the past? What reason do we have for accepting the future like past principle? I mean, obviously, the principle isn't always true, right? I mean, like, yesterday, I wasn't recording this lecture. So today, there's something that's different about about today than the past, right? Later this evening, the sun is going to set slightly earlier than it did yesterday, right? That's because of the time of year that we're in. But, the future today is going to be slightly different than the past yesterday. So the principle isn't like I mean, it's not that it's not airtight. It's that it doesn't apply to everything, but it does seem like it's still true, right? It does seem like it's still a good principle because it's sort of generalized. It doesn't say everything about the future is going to be like the past. It just says, the future is going to be like the past, generally speaking. Well, here's an argument for why we can't believe the FLP principle, and this is derived from some reasoning that Hume had. Basically, the idea is that the future like past principle is unjustified. That is, there's no good reason to believe it. Here's the argument. If your belief in the future like past principle is justified, that is, if you have a good reason to believe it, then it's either justified by direct observation of the fact or by inductive reasoning. Your belief in the future like past principle isn't justified by direct observation. Your belief in the future like past principle isn't justified by inductive reasoning, so your belief in the future like past principle is unjustified. This is a classic dilemma. It says that if your belief is justified in the first place, then one of these two conditions has to hold. It can't be that either of these conditions hold from premises 2 and 3, so it can't be that the first part holds either. So it turns out that FLP is not justified. Now remember, if you want to deny this premise, the way that this works, if you want to deny this conclusion, the way that this works is this is a valid argument. And so you have to try to deny one of these premises. You can deny that your belief is justified by direct observation. You can say that it is justified by inductive reasoning, or you can deny this conditional premise where the idea is something like, basically, you say that this is a false dilemma and that there's a third way. There's some other option here where it's possible for it to be the case that your belief is justified. So what are we gonna do? Well, first, let's back up premise 2, right? So your belief in the future like past principle isn't justified by direct observation. You can't observe that the future is going to be like the past. Why not? Well, because you just can't, right? You can't see the future until it happens. You can't observe the future. In order to do that, you'd somehow have to step outside of time and know what was going to happen in the future, and then compare that to the past, and then determine whether or not the future is actually like the past. But that's not something you can do. You'd have to do that in order to observe that the future is like the past, but you can't do that. You can't step out of time in order to observe the future. You can know maybe that the present is like the past, like how the past was, but that's not the same thing as the future. I'm talking about tomorrow. I'm not talking about today being like the past. I'm talking about tomorrow. Do you know that the sun is going to rise? You know that, the sun rose today, and it rose today and it rose yesterday. So the present is like the past. But do you know that tomorrow the sun is going to rise? You think you do. It seems like it's pretty plausible that you know. But how do you know that? Because you're relying on the future like past principle. You're relying on, I think that tomorrow's going to be like it was today. Well, what reason do you have for thinking that? You can't observe that it's true. Similarly, you can't use induction to come to believe that the future like past principle is true. Remember, induction is the thing that is undergirded by the future like past principle. Induction says, I can believe that, all of the future instances in which I see this one thing are going to be this one way because all of the past instances where I saw this one thing, they were this one way, right? In the future, let's take it like this. In the future, all of the bluebirds that I've ever seen have been blue, right? So in the future, all of the bluebirds that I'm going to see are going to be blue. In the past, all of the crows that I've ever seen have been black. So in the future, all of the crows that I will see are going to be black. That seems like good reasoning. Problem, we can't inductively shore up or reason about FLP. All inductive reasoning about the future assumes the truth of the future like past principle. And if all inductive reasoning about the future assumes the truth of the future like past principle, then any inductive reasoning about the future like past principle is circular. So the idea is, what are we trying to do here? Imagine you're trying to justify the future like past principle, and here's what you say. You say, I believe that the future like past principle is true because in the past, the future was like the past. Right? So you go back to, a time say 4 weeks ago, and you think, the week after 4 weeks ago was pretty much like the week before 4 weeks ago. So I think from that, from the future was like the past back then. Well, now I can justify that, right? And that's because it's been happening so often, it's going to keep happening. The future is going to still be like the past. Problem, that whole set of reasoning assumes that the future is going to be like the past, right? That assumes that your past reasoning, the reasoning that you're using now about how in the past the future like past principle held, is applying that to the future. That in the future like past principle is still going to hold. But that can't be right because you're using now what's called circular reasoning. You're using the principle that you're trying to shore up in the reasoning that you're using to try and shore it up. So it can't be that the FLP is justified by inductive reasoning. Here's another example. It's a little bit easier to grasp for why circular reasoning is bad and doesn't actually justify an argument. Suppose you're arguing for the existence of God. if you do believe in God, definitely don't give this argument, right? Because it's just a bad argument. There are much better arguments for believing in God and for God's existence. So here's a really bad argument for believing in God. Premise one: the Bible says God exists. Conclusion: so God exists. And then someone asks you, well, why should I believe one? Why should I believe that, why should I believe that the Bible says God exists, or why should I believe that the Bible's true? And then you say, well, because God created the Bible, and so the Bible must be true. Problem: this assumes that God exists in order for him to create the Bible, and in order for him to shore up its truth, in order to prove that he exists. That is circular reasoning, right? You can't assume that God exists in order to prove that God exists. You can't assume that God exists in order to shore up the truth of the Bible and thereby, try and prove from the Bible that God exists. That is circular reasoning. You can't assume what you're trying to prove in order to prove it. That's like me saying, suppose I, let's see. Suppose I give you, no, that's a bad example. Well, I think you all get the point. So are we stuck? Can we trust induction? It seems problematic, right? We can't trust the future like past principle. And so is induction really all that great? Is it a good way for us to actually move forward in knowing things? Well, I don't know. It seems like we have to trust some kind of principle. Maybe we have to have faith in some kind of principle that says something like this: for the most part, the future will be like the past, unless it isn't, right? And that is a little bit unsettling because that's just how it goes. The future is like the past until it isn't. Maybe someday the sun's going to stop rising. Maybe someday gravity's not going to work as well as it did. Maybe someday I'm going to wake up and all of the colors and all of in the color spectrum are going to be switched for me. Maybe it's not the case that the future is going to be like the past always, but at the very least, it still seems like it is. And so we just got to keep trucking along. Now, interestingly, there's a major philosophical assumption that's sort of lurking here. And this is a big metaphysical assumption that, is the kind of thing that ultimately Hume wanted to toss out because it just doesn't seem like we have a really good reason to believe it, other than the fact that it just kind of seems true because we don't see things being shifty. And that philosophical assumption is that reality is stable. That, the kinds and categories that come with reality, the fact that there are people and trees and planets and water, liquid, solid, gas, these things continue to exist and are generally stable. They don't shift. We don't have things that are, persons all of a sudden becoming cats. We don't have things that are water all of a sudden, becoming oxygen. We just don't. That's just not how it works, right? Things are, relatively speaking, for some reason, somehow, stable. And that's a metaphysical assumption that it seems like we all have to live with. Whatever it is that exists in reality, whether or not it's physical or mental, or whether or not it's made up of ideas or made up of, natural stuff, it seems like whatever is out there doesn't seem to shift from time to time. Things do change, contingent facts change, but there's some underlying nature of things that is in some way stable. And, maybe we don't have to assume that in our reasoning, but it's the way that things seem. And so sometimes we need a starting point in our reasoning, especially when we're doing science. And, it would be pretty much impossible to do science if we didn't assume, at the very least, that underlying physical substances were, generally speaking, stable. And that underlying, physical stuff, like, from physical particles all the way up to animals, that they're not, that it would be bad. I mean, we just wouldn't be able to do science if it weren't the case that somehow, for some reason, things in the future were at least somewhat like things in the past. All right. Hope you have a good week. Good luck on the quiz this week. This week's quiz is going to be covering some stuff from last week, including a little bit of the end of the ethics stuff and the epistemology stuff from this week. So good luck.